Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about Firebird by Mercedes Lackey. So, I don't know if I'm just picking up more folktale-based books right now, or if, I'm just noticing it a bit more than usual, but here is another fantasy book that heavily leans into folktales. And I know you're probably listening to that going, don't all fantasy books lean into folktales? And no! No, they do not! Most fantasy books are really leaning more into, the previous generation of fantasy books, which are all going back to the previous generation of fantasy books, which all go back to Tolkien, who, did lean a bit into folktales, but also, world wars and stuff. So the important thing is most fantasy books do not actually read like reading fairy tales. This one did. So Firebird follows Ilya Ivanovich, the middle and much despised son of Tsar Ivan, a relatively minor czar who really wants to be a major czar. He has invaded his neighbor's land, he has taken 3 wives to have 8 sons, and he is a bit of a dictator. Ilya has spent his entire life being beaten up by his brothers, with his father subtly encouraging all 8 of his sons to fight amongst themselves, so they cannot band together to rise up against his abusive rule. But when Ivan's beloved cherry trees suddenly start being raided every night, in ways that seem impossible, Ilya's curiosity gets the better of him and he decides he's going to be the one to catch the thief. And when he sees that the thief is a Firebird, a being from legends with feathers that look like they are on fire but never actually burn, and with eyes of a maiden in a bird's face, his curiosity will set him loose on a cascade of events that will eventually put him in a position to either kill an evil sorcerer or die trying. So this book was clearly inspired by Russian folktales in particular, and there are elements of the Russian folktales in here. Like, there are beings straight from the folktales and fairy tales throughout the story. But also, the actual folktales themselves make a bit of an appearance, and the pattern of the story itself feels exactly like a folktale. So the first element of that is the simplest. There are Bannocks, there are Rusalka, there are Leshy, there are ghosts, there are talking animals, magical mazes, there are people who walk around without a heart, literally, and all of them appear pretty much exactly how they do in fairy tales. There's almost no reimagining here. Some of them are given a bit more complexity, a bit more depth, but mostly it's just more detailed explanation and descriptions. And one could argue that a lot of the characters, the bully brothers, the greedy czar, the fool, the kindly but stern adoptive mother figure, the hero, these are all also taken straight from fairy tales. And just like with the more recognizable beasties, all of these characters are not really reimagined at all. They are given a bit more depth, they are given a bit more description, a bit more complexity, they are given voice, but they maintain not just their traditional roles, but also a lot of the traditional elements you expect to see, with almost no subversion whatsoever. And that's not a bad thing. If anything, it can be a cool way to produce something that feels a little bit more like a true retelling, rather than a modernized reimagining. But on that note of lack of modernization, I want to get this out of the way now. This book was published in 1996, and there are definitely things in here that I know that a modern editor would suggest removing. In fact, there are some things in here that I'm really surprised that her editor in 1996 did not say, no, we gotta cut that. Our lead is possibly the horniest protagonist I have ever read in my life. And keep in mind, yes, I have read spicy romance. I don't read it commonly, I've read it. I have read erotica, and none of these characters are as horny as Ilya is. There is no on-page sex in this book. There's brief kissing, there's some touching, there's dreams and imagining, but no actual on-page sex. But he thinks about sex all the time. There's a scene where his brothers have beaten him into a bloody pulp. His life is literally at risk. His friends are literally trying to think of how to help him survive. And what is Ilya thinking about? If they follow through with this plan, he won't get laid for a couple of months, and wondering oh, is there a way I can work around this? And do I still want to try this plan if that means I could not get laid for 4 or 5 months? And that's fine. Like, it's not necessarily my favorite character trait to read, but it's an acceptable one. And like, yeah, maybe 20-something guys are that horny. I don't know. I've never been one. But it does feel a little bit excessive to me. And also the problem comes in a chapter where we're basically getting the setup of all this. We're beginning to see how horny Ilya is. And most particularly, we're learning that at this point he gets laid regularly. And how he gets laid is he sleeps with the dairymaids and the serfs and basically the women who are his inferiors in social caste. And it comes up that he directly thinks that he knows these women are sleeping with him specifically because doing so will get them a better position in the palace and maybe some baubles and trinkets. And he doesn't judge them for it. He is like, yeah, that makes sense. These women need a way to advance in their lives. This is a way to do it, and I get sex out of it. It's fine. It's a little bit weird, but it's fine. And then Ilya thinks about the fact that he is always glad when a girl is not a virgin, because the virgins often cry and carry on. And he knows they're doing it just to guilt him so that they can get better baubles and trinkets. And I was suddenly flipping to the front of the book to make sure that this one was written by a woman. I'm not confused here. This is a Mercedes Lackey. Like, I know what she was trying to do here was to continue showing these women as figures with agency, who are making their own choices and doing things for a reason, and not just like, oh, callous sluts. And also, these women are using the few tools they have available to them to live a livable life. And maybe she was even trying to destigmatize sex work. But it reads a bit like these girls are not fully willing, and he's basically extorting young women into sex. And that's made even more uncomfortable when it's made clear later on in the book that there are moments where it's said that he's dreaming of all the girls that he likes from just barely budding into womanhood, into older motherly types. This is getting very uncomfortable. And like, yeah, it's just, it made me not like him and not want to read about him at all. And like, he does show growth throughout the entire book. In the end, he's less interested in the girl that would just give him a lot of easy sex and happens to be absolutely stunningly beautiful, and is more interested in the girl he shares an actual emotional connection with. But even that ends up coming across less like he gets better about not objectifying women, and more like he's just figuring out which girls are using him. And then there's the race stuff. Like, this is set in a magic version of what is basically Russia, sometime after the introduction of Christianity, but before the Industrial Revolution, which is a huge span of time. But the characters directly imply that all Romani are thieves. They think of Turks and Arabs as barbarous. And like, yeah, that's probably accurate to how an actual Ilya who really lived in that time and place probably would have thought. But it's not deconstructed at all in this book. There's nothing in this book to imply that he's wrong. And to make it even, that would be faintly uncomfortable enough, but to make it even worse, near the end of the book, there are a couple of characters who are Turkish and Muslim. And yeah, they don't have much on-page appearance. They basically just are, you know, talking plot development, but one of them, who happens to be a Muslim character, gets maybe 3 lines in the entire book, and 2 of them are him encouraging Ilya to beat his wife. And yeah, there is also a Russian character who's saying the same thing, but that's just a whole lot of yikes. And on that note, the spousal abuse in this book is a whole lot of yikes. There are numerous references to men hitting their wives, and it's treated lightly and occasionally even playfully, and that's not something I want to read. And there's even a point where our hero, Ilya, watches a man hit a woman and basically thinks she deserves it for being spoiled and unfaithful, and now maybe she'll learn that she made the wrong choice by choosing that man. And the thing is, pretty much all of that does feel accurate to how fairy tales and folktales treat women, abuse, and different races. But the reason that a lot of us choose to read modern versions of folktales rather than just pick up the old folktales is because you get to have the fun elements, the magic, the, fate leading you along, the things that work out just way too easily for people, but you don't have to deal with all that shit. And it leaves me, all that being in here left me at best ambivalent towards our main character and sometimes straight up disliking him. And this is also sort of the thing that, in my opinion, can be fully removed from a story or treated with a lot more care and depth without actually losing those magical folklore vibes. Hell, a couple of the other books I've read recently, which I referenced being very folklore-like, prove that. But I do also want to talk about how folklore is used within the story itself. Because one thing that is weirdly rare in fantasy is for characters to be aware of, to read, to hear, to discuss folk tales that exist within their world. Sort of spoilers here. For a portion of the book, Ilya is pretending to be a fool. Someone both of childlike intelligence, but also sort of a Mad Hatter style of madness. And yeah, that is questionable all on its own, but part of what inspires him to do this is he knows old fairy tales about a fool doing wild and magical things and getting away with anything because he's a fool. And another example is when Ilya first sees the Firebird. He actually spends a while trying to decide if it's a phoenix or a firebird, because he's aware of both of these mythological beings, how they differ and how they're similar. He also thinks about Greek mythology. He thinks about the fact that the reason he's willing to take the advice of a horse is because he knows folk tales where people took advice from a horse and it worked out for them. And this is all slightly different than characters being aware of the actual history and lore within their world. Because quite often in fantasy books, you will see characters who do know about dragons, because dragons are an accepted part of their world. Like, pretty much everyone knows dragons exist. Or you'll hear about characters who know about the gods. But the folklore is often not there. And, sometimes it's just sort of assumed that the world has the same folklore as our world, but often the characters will clearly be unaware of it. They won't know when they come upon a gingerbread house in the middle of the woods that there's probably a witch inside, because somehow they did not read those stories. And this is the rare one that both has the folklore in it, but also does not treat the folklore as an accepted history. There are characters in this book that believe in it. There are characters who don't believe in it. When things start happening to Ilya that feel like folklore, he is a little bit like, this reminds me of that folktale. But he's not going, of course that's how this works. We know the folktales. Of course I should go do that because we know the folktales. And it was just a really interesting way to add depth to a story that already feels like a folktale. And that leads me to the third and final element of the folklore working within this story. This book has the shape much more closely aligned with classic fairy tales and lore than with a modern novel. If you were looking for an inciting incident that leads to a simple rise of action to a climax and then falling action, you're not going to find it in this book. Ilya's true quest starts about 100 pages, maybe 100 pages from the end, and up until then it's sort of just him doing random shit to survive. The Firebird appears roughly 50 pages in and then just disappears, is almost entirely gone for a huge chunk of the book. She appears only as Ilya dreaming of her, and then reappears 100 pages from the end, does a random little thing, disappears for another 50 pages, and then comes back for the climax. And, there's a surprisingly huge amount of time at the beginning of the book that is literally just establishing Ilya's character, basically telling the story of the abused younger son. Then we have a lot of time with Ilya as the fool. Then we have Ilya in the woods. Then we have Ilya in the sorcerer's palace. And each and every one of these segments feels like a disparate story that happened to flow from one into the other. And that's a lot like what it's like to read Beowulf, to read Gilgamesh, to read Snow White and Rose Red. all these old classic folklore and fairy tale stories often have that structure, where it's more a series of events where our protagonist might learn something, he might get a magic tool or a skill, but otherwise element 1 does not directly connect to element 2, element 2 does not directly connect to element 3, etc. But if you are expecting a more traditional novel, you may find yourself feeling that this one reads a bit disjointed, disconnected, or even tangential. It also just means that there are a lot of plot threads that sort of get dropped. Mother Galena, it's pretty heavily set up in the beginning of the book that she's going to be in a very important part of the story, that there's going to be something magical about her, that she's going to be like maybe the fairy godmother type character. And then she just sort of wanders away from the story, like the story just stops talking about her. Another one is, why is Ilya's family so hateful towards him in particular? It's not really established. Like, there's some implication that it's because he's smarter and kinder than the rest of them, but it's not really clearly shown at any point. And, like, randomly the house spirit really feels like it's going to be an important element of the story. It keeps being referenced, and, like, maybe halfway through the book, there's one line that sort of dismisses it and it never comes up again. And there's so many random things like that. And this all increases that feeling that this is a collection of folk tales and not so much a novel. And in many ways, that is cool. But if you go into it expecting a normal novel, you're gonna feel some feelings. I also do want to talk about the ending here, and without spoilers. I'm gonna try my best to avoid spoilers here, but it does feel like a fairy tale. And then there's just a twist. There is a subversion on the ending. And I really like what it's doing, in particular with that subversion. This one is a tiny bit of a spoiler, but not really. But it looks like Ilya's going to get that classic fairy tale ending where he gets the life of ease and power and wealth with a beautiful wife and no need of magic because he has everything he needs. But in the end, instead he chooses magic. And that's great. I love it. That's why I prefer fantasy novels over folk tales. Like that and, you know, not good things. But I love what this ending was trying to do. I will say, it felt a little bit ham-fisted. It felt very much like it was, yes, here's the ending. And I don't like that ending, so I'm going to give it a different ending. And it happened a bit too quick and too slow at the same time for my tastes. But I like what it was trying to do. It also, the ending is inherently tied to which of the two beautiful women he's going to choose as his prize. And that's, well, it's very what I like to call boy fantasy. Back in the day when fantasy was believed to mostly be the realm of boys, that of course young boys like fantasy and girls don't, you saw a lot of books like this, where our lead is a big strong man who's good at fighting but is also witty and is kinder than those around him, but in a really vague sort of way. And like in this book, we're told Ilya's kinder. He thinks about doing kind things, but often it's either he's doing kind things in the hope of a reward, which means it's not really kindness, or he just is thinking about doing a kind thing and then the events go around him. And most of his kindness that we actively see him doing is just not being actively evil. Like, he doesn't force himself on his girls or hit them. Gold star. He doesn't treat the serfs like they are trash. Great. He doesn't try to kill his brothers in return for their violence. Cool. He doesn't hurt the guards while he's training with them. Okay. And so it's mostly just us being told over and over again that he is kind. And to me, the main character trait that he actually showed and that was actually really interesting was, beyond being unreasonably horny, that's besides the point, but his willingness to sacrifice his own dignity to, you know, accomplish his tasks is actually a really interesting trait. That's not one you see in a lot of folktales or fantasy books, especially not boy fantasy. And so that's the one that I really wish they'd explored and played with and talked about, like, that as a major theme, that sometimes you do have to sacrifice your dignity to get what you want. That is cool. But the constant statement over and over again that Ilya is smarter and kinder than his brothers, it just ends up feeling a lot like Ilya being arrogant. Because even though this is third person, it's a close third person, and there are a lot of moments where we see inside the character's head, and most of them is him thinking about how much smarter he is than his brothers. And, like, there are numerous moments where, even after he is separated from his brothers, he's no longer at his home. He doesn't have to deal with his brothers, presumably, possibly ever again. And he'll just see something and go, my brothers would have never been able to do that, because they probably would have just stormed in and shouting challenges. Or, my brothers would have probably killed that animal. Or, my brothers would already be boinking that random woman on the forest floor. I'm better than that. And it did not make me like him. It did not make me think he was better. It just made me think he was arrogant. And that's a huge problem with this book, because he is possibly the only character that stays with us for the entire book. Like, every other character is either at the very beginning and the very end and not in the middle at all, or they're just in the beginning, or they're just in the middle, or they're just in the end. Nobody else appears throughout the entire book. You could negotiably say the Firebird, but the majority of her appearance throughout the book is him dreaming of her. And that's not really being part of the book. And also, within these segments, the beginning, the middle, the end, the different elements, like I mentioned that there are those different segments where Ilya's the fool, Ilya's in the woods. Each of those felt like a disparate story, and the characters within those stories, there'd be at most maybe one or two that got real development, and the rest just felt like cutouts. And so Ilya, in many ways, feels like the only major character. And that also leaves us with a distinct lack of female characters. The Firebird is probably the most prevalent female character. There is Galena at the beginning, but like I said, she vanishes like 60 pages in. There's Vixen, who makes a pretty big impact, but she's only there for one segment of the book. And there's a bird, but, like, notice what I'm saying here. None of these are human females except for Mother Galena. And, like, the Firebird could have been a really interesting character, because she is very humanized, but she spends the majority of her time on page as either a bird or an objective deus ex machina. Like, she appears just to, like, move the story along magically. And the only time that we get to see this character have real conversations with Ilya to, like, really develop the character, one, she is fully playing the classic folklore magic guide character who appears just to be like, that's where you need to go, don't do this, here's the warning that you're going to ignore. And I will argue to my dying day that it is okay to have books that do not have strong female representation, as long as you also have books that do. And so, like, the lack of female representation only annoyed me just because Ilya was not a strong enough character to draw me in on his own. So overall, I will say this was not my favorite Mercedes Lackey book I've ever read. It does do a spectacular job of capturing the tone, structure, elements, and even just the general vibe of folk tales. Also, one thing that I love about Mercedes Lackey is if you've ever been hearing way too much bad writing advice online that you're constantly going, that doesn't sound right, that sounds a bit too dogmatic, or that sounds like complete BS. Pick up a Mercedes Lackey book, because I guarantee you every bit of advice you've heard about writing online, she breaks every last bit of it. She does a lot more telling than she does showing. She has characters with little or even no emotional growth throughout the entire book. Her books don't always make any attempt whatsoever to follow the correct structure of a story. She does not always start with an inciting incident. Quite often the inciting incident is pretty far along in the book, because she starts with just character building shit. She uses a lot of adjectives and adverbs, and she is a beloved author. She has sold over 20 million copies of her books. So if for no other reason, I do suggest you read Mercedes Lackey, because she'll show you that whatever writing advice you're hearing, you can break it and still tell a good story. But overall, do I always love Mercedes Lackey books? No. But I've also never hated one. So yeah, when it comes to this one, maybe read one of her others.